we need to keep being more aggressive about how we're dealing with the ransomware actors as well. It's not enough to tell people you've got to put bars on the window. We also have to do things to reduce crime as well. So we do need, yes, you need to take responsibility for the security within your organization. But again, we as a collective world need to do more things to disrupt the ransomware attacks.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Trust Versus, a podcast powered by HighTrust, a global leader in cybersecurity assurance. I'm Jeremy Huval.
And I'm Robert Booker. Now, Jeremy, as we put together the Season 2 plan, this topic of ransomware had to be on our list. Among those things at the top of the list, it's such a big issue for the industry, how people defend against ransomware, what can people do to risk. Somewhere in all of that, there was this open question of like, who are these people? How do they operate? How can they be disrupted? You know, we needed to find somebody that was an expert to talk to us about that.
Yeah, and no better guest than Allan Liska, better known as the Ransomware Sommelier. He's a ransomware researcher full-time for a company called Recorded Future. And we got to know him because I picked up his book earlier this year. His most recent book, he's written on a lot of security topics. His most recent book is about ransomware, understand, prevent, stuff like that. And so I thought it was such a good book. He seemed like he'd be a good person to talk to on the topic because it was such an authoritative treatment of the subject while remaining such a an easy read. It's a hard balance to walk on any technical content at all. Turns out he's a pretty interesting guy. He publishes his own comic book. He's an actual sommelier in real life, and he really knows his stuff on ransomware. So I thought it was a cool conversation.
We got into it, and in thinking about the topic, we knew it was important because no matter which source you look at, whether it be malware reports, people like Malwarebytes, the security vendors, the FBI, everybody says ransomware and the prevalence of ransomware has exploded. And this concept of extortion and what you'll hear about now, which are different types of extortion coming out of ransomware attacks, is something every company's worried about and they're defending against. And so we said, let's have an episode. Let's talk about ransomware. Let's meet with this expert about it. And then, unfortunately, we had the issue with Change Healthcare happen, which impacted the health industry in a dramatic way. And it became yet an even more important topic, not only a topic that we're interested in because we like to think about these things and how to mitigate these threats, but regulators are talking about it. Anybody that's a leader in technology is concerned about it even more. And, there is a response that is needed, and we need to understand the problem better.
Yeah, no one is going to believe us that we wanted to talk about ransomware before the industry event happened. It's true, because we've been talking about this for a while, even on season 1. If this isn't a high-risk item on an organization's risk assessment, it should be, because it's just so prevalent. And one of the themes you'll hear in this conversation is on the other side of the equation, the bad guys have turned this into a science, a business, an industry, and they've got a really streamlined machine, unfortunately, for the rest of us. So we'll talk about sort of the different personas and actors and motivations and perspectives from some of these actors in the industry. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation with Allan on ransomware.
Well, today we're talking to Allan Liska with an interesting title of Ransomware Sommelier. Allan is just a great resource, and we're so grateful to have him join us today. He's active on X, or I still call it Twitter, I guess. Has a ransomware blog, creates comic books. He's a photographer, and he's really been an important contributor to conferences like RSA and SleuthCon. He's also a really key role of a company I respect well, Recorded Future, as part of their computer security incident response team, and has consulted on the ransomware episode of John Oliver's Last Week Tonight. Written several really interesting books, which I highly recommend as a security leader and for non-security leaders in understanding this problem about different aspects of not only IT security, but now this problem we're all facing in the industry together of ransomware, with his latest book titled Ransomware, Understand, Prevent, and Recover. Allan, welcome, and thanks for joining us from Singapore tonight.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so I think, we always are like, let's talk about this important topic that we're dealing with. And we want to explore different dimensions. But as we were looking at the book and really thinking about the body of work and research you've provided to the industry, we actually were really struck, as Jeremy and I looked at it, we were struck by the fact that you laid out this ransomware problem as understanding, preventing, and recovering, and that I think in my career, I've seen it evolve heavily. It's very different now, and so I think just thinking about where we are today here, mid 24. We just had in the health industry, arguably the largest event that's taken place, which clearly sort of had dimensions that would all fall within the category of what we think of as ransomware, but so many more things. If you were to write the book today, what are the lessons and changes you've seen in the past year? Kind of what's the thing right now that, on the elevator, Allan, what do we need to be thinking about today?
So interestingly, if we think about ransomware as a really bad movie franchise, so like some of the later Halloween movies where you get to Halloween 8, 9, and 10, I think this year is Ransomware 3, and the subtitle is Law Enforcement Strikes Back. Because what we're starting to see this year is the accumulation of all the intelligence that law enforcement has gathered, and the effects, finally starting to see the effects of President Biden's Global Ransomware Task Force, which enabled intelligence sharing across 53 countries now. What that's led to is you start in December with the Alfie takedown, and that seems to have been fairly permanent. And then you had the first arrest of Scattered Spider. Remember, Scattered Spider was the ransomware group that hit the casinos in Vegas. Then you had the first takedown of Lockbit, but that was an ongoing PSYOP operation, and very intentionally so by the NCA. Then you had the second arrest of a Scattered Spider member in Spain. Then you had the Operation Endgame, which disrupted a lot of the initial access. And then you had the second takedown, not only of Lockbit, but we got his full name, his address, and everything else you'd want to know about him. Again, can't arrest him because he lives in a harbor country, but made him a pariah in the underground community. And so effectively actually not only disrupted him, but kept him from restarting it. And then just earlier this week, we had law enforcement action to disrupt Cobalt Strike, non-registered Cobalt Strike, so illegally obtained Cobalt Strike infrastructure. And that is a tool used by a lot of ransomware groups because it's essentially a red teaming tool, which if that's too technical, that means like if you're testing your network for vulnerabilities, you use a tool like Cobalt Strike, but also bad guys use that because it's designed to be invisible. And bad guys love to use it and they don't pay for the license. And so disrupting that activity makes it harder for ransomware actors to carry out their act. So we're really seeing compounded law enforcement activity.
Yeah, I actually remember the early to mid-February Alfie had been impacted. There were some rumblings publicly reported, as well as some underground rumblings, that the actors really pivoted from sort of a hands-off to medical and healthcare institutions to like, we're going to be no holds barred because we're responding to the fact that we've been subject to this law enforcement activity. Really is credible? Is that a real thing that's happening? And do we kind of see that back and forth, tit for tat kind of thing with the way these actors look at themselves?
So one of the things that the ransomware actors need to remember, they're the goddamn bad guys. They're the ones who are breaking the law, and they don't get to be offended when law enforcement comes after them, and it bugs me when they do that. But the reality is that they've gone after hospitals before. Lockbits hit hospitals. Last year, they hit the Children's Healthcare in Canada, the Sick Kids Hospital in Canada. We've seen Alfie hit hospitals. We've seen, you can say, oh, we're going to go after all these things. You've already gone after all these things. So there's really nothing else for you to go after that you haven't already gone after. So no, I don't put any credibility in that.
I'm thinking back to a Mike Myers interview that I saw a while ago where he was talking about his characters in all of his videos. And he said, look, to write a good bad guy, the bad guy has to believe that they're the good guy of their own story. And Alan, you said something very similar about the ransomware actors themselves actually seeing themselves as sort of performing a service.
At least on the surface, they try to give this air of professionalism. They call themselves pen testers. They call you'll see on the extortion sites where their data leak sites, where they'll call them the victim's partners or customers or something like that. And in fact, and I relayed this story in the book. I was part of helping an organization recover, and the organization decided not to bring in a ransomware negotiator, which I always recommend. You should never do the negotiation yourself. You definitely shouldn't ask me to do the negotiation, because I don't know if you're familiar with the movie Fifth Element with Bruce Willis, where he takes out the bad guys and says, anybody else want to negotiate? That's how I'd want to negotiate with them. So the CEO had said, no, you know what? I'm going to do the negotiation. I can handle this. I do deals all the time. And he gets in and he gets extremely frustrated and starts cussing at the person on the other end. And they get immediately offended. And, I remember this quote verbatim because it just kind of burned in my head with how the ransomware groups are approaching it. The person on the other end said, sir, I've been nothing but polite to you. If you can't show the same level of respect, we're going to end the conversation now. And it's like, again, you're the bad guy, you're extorting somebody, and you're trying to pretend that you are the professional. But that is, if it's not the way they see themselves, it's certainly the way that they try to present themselves. And again, if you go look at any of these ransomware actor websites, these extortion sites where they post victim data, there's like a link where you can contact for press inquiries. And if you want to sign up to be a partner, there's another link to do that, and so on. They try to put this forward as a business.
And you mentioned the ransomware negotiator, and it's fascinating the level of new personas that have sprung up around this $1 trillion industry now. The ransomware negotiator is obviously one, and sort of the act is in the name. But another one you talked about is the separation between initial access brokers and actually the ransomware organization. Can you talk about the role of initial access brokers and how maybe it's two separate attacks, each potentially with different dwell times?
What we've developed, because ransomware has been so incredibly successful for so long now. I started working on trying to stop ransomware back in 2015 when I was working for FireEye before I moved over to Recorded Future. So on the one hand, you can say I kind of suck at this and maybe nobody should listen to anything I say. But we've seen this ongoing growth and continued and sustainable growth to the point where ransomware is one of the most profitable types of cybercrime. And because of that, there is this sort of sub-industry that's built up in support of these ransomware groups and this division of labor. So we think of a ransomware attack as a single attack. X company got hit by ransomware, blah, blah, blah. But most of the time, it's actually at least two separate attacks. So we have initial access brokers, and that is exactly what they do. They go out and they get access to the networks, and then they turn around and they sell that access to the actual ransomware operator, the person that's going to be hands on the keyboard to deploy the ransomware. It allows the ransomware actors to carry out more attacks in a year because they buy the access and then they just have to deploy the ransomware. They don't have to worry. They already have admin access when they walk in to the network, and so they just have to get in, steal data, deploy ransomware. And so you can do multiple attacks a month. If you had to go and get your own access, that's going to slow down how many attacks you can carry out. And so the initial access brokers make good money because depending on the size of the company, the type of access, where it's located, they can make anywhere from a few thousand to a few $100,000 for each network sold. And then the ransomware operators make money, obviously, when anybody pays a ransom. And if they're part of a ransomware as a service, the guy that runs the ransomware as a service offering, they get a cut of that as well. So basically, all of these groups keep making money. And that means that they not only attract more people to come and sign up to be an initial access broker or be a ransomware operator or start their own ransomware as a service, but it keeps this underground economy continuing to grow. And then there are all these other side hustles there. So we have developers that specifically work on ransomware and the types of tools that ransomware operators use when they're in their network. You also have people that do their money laundering, and money laundering not in a traditional sense. That's actually one of the things these guys are really bad at. When we talk about money laundering, we talk about running things through crypto mixers and things like that. But compared to other types of organized crime, so if I am a drug dealer and I've made a bunch of money, I'm probably using some of that money to invest in a restaurant or invest in other ways to actually clean it. Whenever we have been able to arrest one of these guys, like in the Ukraine, in Romania, in South Korea, etc., they have literally USB drives with their wallets on it, with all their crypto on it. Sometimes they get cash out of it, so there'll be boxes of cash. But for the most part, they haven't figured out that second part, how to turn all of this crypto money that they've gotten into an actual legitimate business. And I find that kind of fascinating that they can't make that next leap.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the other personas that I thought was so fascinating is sort of the exploitation broker. In your book, you mentioned there's sort of a small collection of initial access avenues. And one of them is obviously phishing and credential stuffing is another. Vulnerability exploitation. So it's kind of fascinating to me that of this enormous threat of ransomware, if you break it down to how the actual initial access part of it, I think the list that you gave in your book was phishing, credential stuffing, reuse, especially around RDP, breaches of third parties, insider threats, and social engineering. And what strikes me is that these aren't new. And to me, the best protections against all those is probably good security hygiene, like actually good management of your IT systems and proactively addressing patch management and stuff like that. Is my read off is basically the best way to avoid falling victim to one of these ransomware attacks? Good hygiene?
That's one of the things that is incredibly frustrating about ransomware defense is if you stop the initial access, you don't have to worry about any of the other stuff. And you go to the floor of RSA or Black Hat, and there's all these vendors that are selling you all of these fantastically great, wonderful tools that do that. But really what it comes down to is good asset management, good identity management, and good data management. If you can do those three things, and it's really easy for us to sit on a podcast when we're not the CISO of a large multinational organization to say things like that. But that's really what it comes down to. Because if you are handling and running good identity management, you're going to find out when there's leaked credentials. Or if you miss that for whatever reason, you're going to find out when a machine on your network is talking to machines that it shouldn't be talking to or doesn't normally talk to. That's part of good identity management. If you're talking about good asset management, you're going to know what systems need to be patched. And you're going to know which systems the ransomware actors use. Like they love SSL VPNs. Whenever a new vulnerability is announced in any SSL VPN, that is exploited within 24 hours and widely exploited. So you have to patch that immediately. You can't go through all right, our patch window is next Tuesday. No, your patch window is now. For this thing in particular, your patch window is now. And if anybody in senior management has a problem with that, just say, look, whatever downtime we're going to experience, if something goes wrong here, is nothing compared to the downtime that we're going to experience with a ransomware attack. And then, of course, good data management, because data theft is such an important part of a ransomware attack, and the bad guys don't care where they get your data from. You need to know where your data is, not just locally, not just in your cloud, but with all of your partners and vendors' clouds. They're in New York City, ahead of the 10 o'clock news for decades. They ran a PSA saying it's 10 p.m. Do you know where your kids are? You know where your children are? And that's like what I tell people. Do you know where your data is? My marketing team and my HR team both really hate this analogy, but it's kind of like the STD analogy, right? It's not just, who you've slept with, but who all of your partners have slept with. And it's the same thing. It's not just where your data is, but where all of your partners are storing your data.
Yeah, especially in healthcare, there's so much reliance on third parties and fourth parties and fifth parties. That information supply chain, that data supply chain is a very real factor and really your exposure.
It's such a challenge to keep track of the information, and it's not always clear who's the primary data source and who's the data consumer. So how you look at that system is quite challenging. Allan, as I think about the evolution though of this, and you've really described how we're walking through this series of, I guess, movies or the journey that we see as this story is being told. The thing I continue to worry about is just the level of different forms of extortion we're seeing. Going back to the beginning, your system is encrypted; you can't get into it. Now we see the data theft and data extortion. What's going to happen next, or what are we seeing the edges of? Are there other forms of extortion out there?
Well, I do think that there is a concern about violence as a service because, which is so. When we look back at Scattered Spider, which are the ones that carried out again the attacks against Johnson Controls and the casinos, they are part of a larger underground group called COM, and that's kind of a loose association of gamers and hackers and so on. And there's a lot of violence as a service that's part of that group, and that it mostly revolves around bricking, and that is literally paying somebody to go to somebody else's house and throw a brick through their window. And that's something that in a small subset of the gaming community has kind of taken hold, but in COM, that was kind of part of that. So there is this interest in violence as a service, at the very least, at dropping the hints. I've seen this in negotiations where, remember, the ransomware actors have gotten so much data on your organization, they can say things like, hey, here's where your CEO lives. We have their address. Something's going to happen to them if we don't get paid. Whether or not they follow through with that is a completely different story. We just saw the case of a ransomware group who harassed an organization that wasn't going to pay and didn't pay by calling them repeatedly, by just any phone number in the organization, calling them and telling them to pay. We've seen this. We've already seen many times where ransomware groups, when they hit a school, they will then reach out to the parents. If the school refuses to pay, and most schools, at least in the US, cannot pay, they'll reach out to the parents and say, we have your kids' sensitive data, and we're going to push that publicly unless you make the school pay, or you can pay us. We saw that with mental patients in the Netherlands, where the ransomware actors called the patients directly after the clinic refused to pay and say, hey, we have all of your notes from all of your sessions, and we're going to publish them unless you give us $50. So they are always looking for ways to push the boundaries and to find new ways to inflict pain on their victims.
Wow. It's fascinating because I think about ransomware being like the traditional definition. I'm going to get in your network. I will encrypt the data on site. It won't leave. And then you get a pop up that says you got to pay to decrypt the data. What you just described is so much more than that. Just I'm encrypting it. Maybe not. I'm taking it off site. I'm going to hold it for ransom. Probably. And we see that more and more. But you mentioned double, triple, quadruple extortion. Is that what you're talking about? All these different avenues of actually getting the money?
Yeah, that's exactly why we talk about multiple extortion avenues for these ransomware groups, because that's what they're doing. We've even seen them threaten to report organizations to government agencies, for not properly securing their networks, and to regulatory bodies, et cetera. Just anything that they can do that they think is going to ramp the pain up.
So let's shift a bit from sort of the understanding area. Your book was organized by understand, prevent, and recover. Let's change out of the understanding role a bit. Let's talk about maybe some of the recovery aspects. How does cybersecurity insurance play into this? Like, for example, will they pay the ransom?
It depends. Most cyber insurance companies at this point will not pay the ransom. They will not allow a payout to be used for it. That's changed over the last couple of years. For many years, you could just have the insurance company and they would pay it. But there's such a blowback from that. And, you probably saw last year, maybe the year before, where cyber insurance companies were complaining about how much money they lost because of all the ransomware attacks. We are seeing a change in the way many cybersecurity providers approach insuring people. One, they're making it harder to get insurance. They're certainly raising premiums. Their clients are having to increase their baseline of security in order to renew their policy. So no, the insurance company most likely will not pay your ransom. However, if you do get hit, they can provide a negotiator for you. They likely can provide an incident response company for you. Now, what I tell people as part of the prevention strategy, you need to know all this in advance. You do not want to find this out the day that you are hit with ransomware. It's why, and I mentioned this in the book, I highly encourage tabletop exercises, because that way you can walk through, hey, we're hit with ransomware. What are the steps? What are we going to do? Let's call the insurance company. Okay, do we actually know the insurance company will do these things? No, great. Let's find that out and let's document that somewhere. Ideally, not on a hard drive that's going to be encrypted by the ransomware groups. Have a printed copy of that somewhere. And as you update that, print out new copies of it. So you actually, with the right cyber insurance company, you can have a really good partner that can help you a lot. And so I think that is, I think that's a really important thing for companies to do. But then there are other ways, even if you don't have cyber insurance, that you can, recover from a ransomware attack.
Yeah, absolutely. And the cost of recovery alone is staggering. I don't know what the average cost is, but one of the examples from the book that stood out to me was there was a service in Ireland that got attacked, and they were a health service. And because it was during COVID, the bad guys said, look, we don't want to affect health. Here's the decryption key. And even though they got the decryption key for free, that organization still spent millions of dollars and took months to recover, even removing the factor of the ransom, which they didn't have to pay. How is, where does this money go? Is it actually having to stand up that many servers in succession?
Well, think about the Irish healthcare service. And in that example, they actually had to bring in the National Guard. So you were paying National Guardsmen. Now, that's a national healthcare service. So they were deployed all over the country restoring systems. But restoring systems takes a long time, right? We think, oh, yeah, if a system goes down and I have to recover from backup, I can do that in a couple of hours. If 1,000 systems are down or 2,000 systems are down and your backup servers only have so much bandwidth to them, then multiply that couple of hours by thousands of hours. And that's just to bring the systems back online. But your process has to be pretty thorough, because otherwise you are reintroducing the ransomware into your network. Maybe not the ransomware itself, but the tools that the ransomware actor used and left behind on the machine. If those were backed up and you bring those back online, you're giving them access. Even then, you have to thoroughly go through all of your systems to understand what they did in your network. So one of the things that a lot of ransomware actors do is, they love your Active Directory server. Once they get in the network, that's the first place they're going to go. They're going to embed themselves in there, because if you have access to Active Directory, you have access to everything. And one of the things they'll do is they'll create an additional 4 or 5 admin accounts, right? So, and maybe they use one of them or 2 of them. That means there are 3 or 4 more just sitting there waiting in case they get kicked out of the network to log back in. So you have to do a thorough audit. And how closely are you monitoring the logs from your Active Directory server? Are you monitoring for new admin account creation? You should be. In fact, you should alert even before the ransomware attacks happen. There should be big red flags going off in your SOC if new admin accounts are created and if successive new admin accounts are created. But oftentimes I find that that's just not the case. Things that surprise me all the time that aren't expensive security things to put in place, So, for example, the first thing a ransomware actor does when he lands on a new box is he kills whatever security program you have running on there. So, your fancy EDR doesn't do you any good if they shut it down. Here's the question: why isn't your SOC raising huge red flags if a third party tool shuts down your EDR on a workstation? If they do that, that should be okay. Let's get all hands to that workstation and figure out what's happening and why, because there should never be a third party system or third party program shutting down your EDR. Same thing with the, again, admin account creations. I know some networks are really busy and really complex. I don't think even in some of the most complex networks, creating new Windows admin accounts should be done on a regular basis.
Yeah, it's sort of the silver bullet of what to monitor, given the thousands and thousands of security alerts that can be generated from even a moderately sized network. The other one that you mentioned in the book is, I think it was disablement of the shadow volume logging, something like that. If that goes, that is like a common fingerprint in all ransomware attacks. And if you alert for disablement of the shadow volume logging inside of Windows, that has to be treated as such a high level alert, as opposed to one that just might fade into the background and we might look at 2 weeks from now when we get around to it, if we look at it at all. Yeah, it's fascinating because it seems like you have to be smart about understanding what to monitor. And we all try to risk rank our security alerts and have tools to do that for us. And SOAR tries to help. It's interesting because it sort of turns a bit of that on its head. And in incident response, a lot of these incident response patterns that I used to see where the Exchange server went down, what are we going to do without that one server? But with disaster recovery and incident response being, I have 2,000 hosts down, what do? It turns it on its head. Yeah, it's a different mindset, because if I think, look, of course I do security incident response tabletops. We've been doing them for the last 10 years, and we think we got a good tabletop process. What fascinated me as well about that topic, particularly in your book, was there's an entire chapter dedicated to tabletops, just about how to do them for a ransomware. Not how to do them, but just here's the specifics for ransomware. So my takeaway was, even if you do security incident tabletop exercises and you're really good at it, if you don't intentionally weave ransomware into that content and into that exercise, you're not doing it good enough to address this particular threat. So another question I want to ask you was that you've given over 300 talks and webinars on ransomware, and you mentioned that in almost every case, someone asks, should we pay the ransom? Instead of asking that question, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the context around the payment. Like, is paying the ransom legal, and can you get in any trouble for paying a ransom? And maybe what's the overall impact of paying a ransom on the business and maybe the landscape as a whole?
Unfortunately, it's not illegal. I do think it should be. I've evolved in my thinking on that, but we're losing the fight for ransomware right now. And, we have to take more drastic actions. Now, there are times where it is illegal. So if a ransomware entity is sanctioned, so like Lockbit now is sanctioned, Conti is sanctioned, North Korea, very heavily sanctioned, and North Korea does operate some ransomware groups as well, then it can be illegal to pay them a ransom. Now, you're likely not going to suffer too much. You're going to get a fine or whatever, because nobody wants to punish the victim. But that is something, and that's why it's so important to have your lawyers involved in that discussion when you're doing this, because it should never be a security decision. I make that point in my book. It's a security decision. The answer is always no. It's a business decision and a legal decision. You have to know what to do. Now, oftentimes, if in the U.S., if you reach out to the Treasury Department or Secret Service and say, hey, we have to pay this ransom, we think this is a sanctioned entity, they will give you a waiver for that. Not always as fast as you may need it, but they can do that. The problem with paying a ransom is it makes the ransomware actors so much better at what they do, because that money gets reinvested in building new building new and better ransomware and new and better tools. The other thing it does is it serves as a giant billboard for any other threat actor that's thinking about getting into ransomware, oh, I might get $10 million if I sign up and do ransomware and I hit the right victim. I might get $15 million, whatever. We've seen ransoms paid as high as 40 million, and there's even rumors of a $70 million ransom out there. And that's more than I make in a year. If I'm living in Russia, or if I'm living in Romania, or almost anywhere in the world, and I see that I can potentially make $70 million if I hit the right victim, I'm going to then want to do ransomware. So, and this is really where I have a problem. I have a whole lot of sympathy for like a small rural hospital that gets hit with ransomware. They can't afford to hire a security staff. I totally get that. And then they're stuck and they have to pay a ransom. Where I have a big problem is multinational, multi-billion dollar companies that can afford to invest in security and don't, and then take the easy way out by paying a ransom. Then they're making things that much harder on that small rural hospital, or those smaller victims that can't afford to hire security staff, that can't afford to have a robust security program. And that's really where it kind of drives me nuts, that I feel like those big companies that know better should be more responsible because they're making it harder for everyone else.
It really is a social problem that we're all contributing to when we enrich the attackers. So Allan, really great conversations. We kind of come to the close of our time here. Yeah, I just want to kind of reconcile something that you said in your book. And basically, despite what some would believe, being victimized by a ransomware attack is not inevitable. You've described some things that are foundational to allowing organizations to reduce and manage that risk. But when we actually look at the news, I mean, the largest entities in several industries, falling victim to ransomware. How do we kind of reconcile that in our mind? If even these very large, very well-funded security programs with highly skilled operators can fall victim, is there actually hope for that hospital supporting an underserved community?
We know how the ransomware operators work. They're not doing anything original or interesting. Some of the initial access techniques, yes. Especially when we start to see things like social engineering and stuff like that, that's a lot harder to defend against. But fundamentally, they have to all do the same things once they get in the network. And once they're in the network, the tools that they use, whether it's PowerShell scripts, whether it's Cobalt Strike, whether they're living off the land using Windows basic tools, you can monitor and alert for those, and you don't have to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars or whatever. But you do need to have a competent security staff. And so, yes, a small rural hospital could, in theory, do it. Now, are they going to? Probably not, because if they invest money in security, then maybe one less kidney machine that they can, dialysis machine that they can buy. And I totally get that. And that's where I think for things that we consider critical infrastructure, we need to better invest in helping them secure themselves. I would much rather have my tax dollars going to helping hire more security people for small rural hospitals and organizations that need that help than some of the other things that it goes to. For larger organizations, I really, again, I don't never want to victim blame, but I also don't always have a lot of sympathy, because you should be able to do this. We see this all the time. The financial sector is a great example. Large banks, they get intruded all the time, and they stop it, and you never hear about Bank of America or Chase or whatever getting hit with ransomware. Now, we did see the International Commerce Bank of China last year get hit, but that's kind of on a different level. And, again, that is because banks do take security very seriously, but they also do a lot of internal intelligence sharing through the FSISAC and other intelligence sharing apparatuses there. And there's the healthcare ISAC, which I think does a really great job of alerting and letting hospitals and other healthcare providers know what the threats are. But I don't think as many people take their alerts as seriously as they should. So there is hope. We could stop them. But I do think the other thing is we need to keep being more aggressive about how we're dealing with the ransomware actors as well. It's not enough to tell people you've got to put bars on the window. We also have to do things to reduce crime as well. So we do need, yes, you need to take responsibility for the security within your organization. But again, we as a collective world need to do more things to disrupt the ransomware attacks. We need do a better job of making sure they can't get paid. We need to do a better job of turning them into pariahs within their harbor countries, where if we can't go after them, at least we can make sure that they are very uncomfortable wherever it is that they are.
Well said. Well said. Well, again, I wish I had 2 hours to talk because I was so fascinated by the book. I learned a lot. I highly recommend it. Ransomware, Understand, Prevent, Recover. You can find Allan at ransomwaresommelier.com, on X, and you're a frequent speaker at conferences. And you have a fan or two at High Trust. And thanks so much for spending the time and sharing the word and sharing knowledge with us about the threat of ransomware.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been absolutely my pleasure. And, I'd love to come back in another year or so, and hopefully I have better and happier news. We can pop a bottle of champagne and talk about that we've actually started to see ransomware go down.
Looking forward to it. So, Robert, I thought I had a pretty good command of the risk of ransomware and sort of the threats associated with ransomware bad guys. And I learned a lot from this conversation, and I learned a lot from the book. I think it's reflective of there's just a lot of content in this world of ransomware.
I did as well, Jeremy. And like you, I've spent a lot of time in this space, and I felt like I had real command of it. But, the two things that really resonated with me were the disruption that is actually beginning to take place, and the fact that, this is a war in cyberspace that's happening between nations and between these criminals. And that may be starting to bear fruit, which gave me some optimism for the future, and countered with a heavy dose of pessimism with just the fact that these entities are stepping up the way that they threaten their victims, different forms of extortion, including things that are just super frightening for the victims. And that just to me is so troubling. So, I was somewhat heartened by it, but also left feeling like it's still a tough space to work in.
Yeah, I don't think this risk is going anywhere. I mean, there's so much money in it now. The size of this market that the ransomware actors have created, it's too big. It's not, in my opinion, going away, which really underscores the risk or the importance of like a strong control environment for organizations, big and small, to protect against the initial access that these initial access brokers are selling, and to detect it if a bad guy's in your system and maybe one of your servers is on some ransomware market, to sell from an initial access broker to a ransomware actor, to figure it out during that dwell time period, to actually shut it down before the actual ransomware encryption or exfiltration happens, and to recover from it. Like I think we talked a bit about in the interview, having a ransomware negotiator or a ransomware negotiator company on retainer. I think larger and even mid-sized organizations are going to need some of that. But it's that prevention is worth an ounce of detection and cure, right? So if we can prevent the bad guys from actually coming in and prevent that initial access, it's so valuable. I asked the question to Allan and he confirmed it. It's that cybersecurity hygiene that is really the answer. There's no silver bullet. There's no one single control that you can implement to actually stop this from happening. Instead, it's a collection of processes and settings and policies, and it's just the cybersecurity hygiene that we all expect and we all kind of take for granted when it's working. When it's not, this is one of the things that could happen. And we're learning more and more that this happens very fast. And so we know about cybersecurity hygiene. Robert, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was actually really encouraged to hear Allan say that it is a solvable problem. Good cybersecurity hygiene and an approach to cybersecurity foundations, that this problem can be solved. You can detect these folks early in the attack cycle. Jeremy, the work we did with creating our Essentials capability last year was designed specifically to help organizations that are starting an assurance journey to say, I've hit those basic hygiene requirements. I've met the essentials. I know that I've delivered the foundation of what I need to protect my system, and very definitely relevant to what Allan told us. So it's just a validation for me that our thinking was right and our research research was right as you put that together and we put that together. So.
Yeah, absolutely. It's those essential foundational controls that are going to prevent this from happening. Stuff like multi-factor authentication, which we all have come to appreciate even more recently, is one of those silver bullet controls, but alone can't do it. It's good patch management, especially patching the browser. It's really strong controls over remote access tools like RDP built into Windows. Stuff like that plays such an important role you just cannot overlook, and you have to do.
Yes, and something I've known as a practitioner, the monitoring and management of your authentication layer. In many cases, Windows Active Directory, detecting those new administrative accounts when bad actors create them. Something you can instrument, you can script against, and you can see. And the disablement of some of your defensive layer, like your EDR tools or your antivirus tools. I mean, those are super helpful things that are approachable and can be practical for really companies of any size. And another thing I thought about, Jeremy, in listening to the interview was the fact that insurance is a part of the solution. And, we just talked recently in our last episode about cyber insurance and the fact that, helping organizations demonstrate that they have these controls is important to gain, an insurance product and underwriting. It's really about underwriting the risk, but having the controls in place to earn the underwriting. So good hygiene, you can get insurance and you can also protect your system. I think that's a win-win.
Yeah, and Allan mentioned, it's worth repeating, organizations that already have a cyber insurance policy may have ransomware recovery and incident response offerings available as part of that policy, which you may or may not know about. It's worth looking into if you hold a cybersecurity policy, and if you're shopping for it, it's something to expect and demand. So really important, and having sort of that backdrop, someone to call if the bad day comes in this form. So Allan's book, again, is Ransomware, Understand, Prevent, Recover. Highly recommended. I enjoyed it. I learned a lot out of it, even being sort of a seasoned IT security professional. I think it's worth a read. We're very grateful for Allan's time and talking to us. So thanks everyone for listening, and we look forward to the next episode.